He was born into a world that did not want weak men. A world of ice, salt water, and blades that decided everything words could not. They called him Rollo, and the stories say he was so large, so heavy, so impossibly strong, that no horse in his homeland could carry him for long without breaking beneath the weight. He walked instead. A giant among raiders, exiled from his own land for refusing to bow to a king he did not believe deserved his loyalty. He should have died forgotten, just another Viking name lost to a cold northern sea. Instead, he sailed south, into the heart of a kingdom that had survived Charlemagne himself, and did something no raider before him had ever managed. He did not just burn it, he took it. And then, in the strangest twist in all of medieval history, the very king he had humiliated handed him land, a title, and a daughter to marry, and asked him to stay. This is the story of Rollo, the Viking who became the father of the Normans, and without knowing it, the great-grandfather of every English king who came after him.
Almost nothing about Rollo's early life survives with any certainty, and that uncertainty itself tells you something about the world he was born into. He was likely born sometime around the year 846, somewhere in Scandinavia, possibly Norway, possibly Denmark, in a society that did not keep careful records of the births of men who were not yet kings. What the old chronicles do agree on is the shape of him, a man so physically enormous that the sagas remember him by a nickname, Rollo the Walker, because the horses of his homeland simply could not carry his weight across any real distance. Imagine being a child who already knew, by the way grown men looked at him, that he was built differently, that he would either become something extraordinary or something the world would try very hard to break. The Scandinavia Rollo grew up in was not gentle. Power belonged to whoever could hold a sword steady longer than the man standing across from him, and kings ruled only as long as enough warriors agreed they deserved to. The medieval chronicler Dudo of St. Quentin, writing generations later and likely smoothing over uncomfortable details, tells us Rollo was exiled from Norway, possibly for raiding lands the king considered protected, possibly simply for becoming too powerful, too independent, too dangerous to a ruler who could not control him. Whatever the precise reason, the result was the same. A young man with nothing left to lose, cut off from his homeland, his family, his place in the only world he had ever known, and given exactly one path forward: the sea. For Rollo and men like him, exile did not mean weakness, it meant freedom from consequence, and he used that freedom the only way he knew how. He raided the coasts of England first, then deeper, into the rivers and towns of what is now northern France, a kingdom still calling itself the heir of Charlemagne but already crumbling under the weight of its own internal wars, weak kings, and constant infighting among nobles who cared more about their own land than the empire's survival. Rollo and his Viking warbands moved through this fractured kingdom like men who understood exactly what they were looking at, a body too distracted fighting itself to properly defend its own throat. By the 880s and 890s, Rollo's name had become something close to a curse whispered in the towns along the river Seine. He burned monasteries. He took ransoms from terrified bishops. He sailed his longships further inland than anyone believed possible, and twice, he laid siege to Paris itself, the most important city in West Francia, a city that had already survived one famous Viking siege a generation earlier and now found history repeating itself at its gates. The Frankish kings threw armies at him. They threw money at him. Nothing seemed to make him stop, because Rollo was no longer simply raiding for plunder. He was building something, slowly, violently, without fully realizing it himself. A reputation that no king in West Francia could afford to ignore any longer. By the year 911, the king of West Francia, a young and largely powerless ruler named Charles, known to history as Charles the Simple, found himself facing a problem that no army he could raise seemed able to solve. Rollo had besieged the city of Chartres that summer, and although the defenders, against every expectation, had managed to hold the walls, the message was unmistakable. This Viking commander was not going away. He could be slowed, he could be wounded, he could not, it seemed, be defeated outright, not with the resources Charles actually had available to him rather than the resources a king was supposed to have on paper. So Charles did something that, on its surface, looked like surrender, and in many ways was exactly that. but which history would eventually recognize as one of the shrewdest political gambles of the entire early medieval period. Rather than continuing to bleed men and silver trying to destroy Rollo, Charles offered him something almost unimaginable. Land, not a bribe to leave, but a permanent grant of territory along the lower Seine River, the very region Rollo had spent years raiding, on the condition that Rollo convert to Christianity, swear loyalty to the Frankish crown, and use his Viking forces to defend that same stretch of coastline from future raiders, men exactly like the one he himself had been only months before. The two men are said to have met at Saint Clair sur Epte in the autumn of 911. Picture that moment honestly. A Frankish king, representing centuries of Christian, Carolingian tradition, sitting across from a pagan Viking warlord who had burned his churches, ransomed his bishops, and twice brought his capital to the edge of catastrophe. And instead of an execution, a negotiation. Instead of a battlefield, a treaty. The chroniclers tell us Rollo was meant to kneel and kiss the king's foot as a gesture of submission, and that he refused to bend that low himself, instead ordering one of his own men to lift the king's foot up to his mouth, a small, telling detail, if true, of a man who would accept a crown's authority but never quite his own humiliation. What Rollo did next surprised everyone who expected a Viking raider to simply take the land and abandon his new obligations the moment it suited him. He did not. He converted, taking the baptismal name Robert, married Charles's daughter Gisela, and set about doing something almost no one in his violent life could have predicted. He governed. He brought in his own Norse followers and settled them across the territory, but he also worked, deliberately, to blend his Viking inheritance with the Frankish, Christian world around him, building what would soon be called Normandy, the land of the Northmen, a place that within a few generations would speak French, practice Christianity, and yet never quite forget the longships and the cold northern blood that built it. The raider who could not be stopped by force had been stopped, instead, by an offer he chose, against every instinct of his old life, to honor. Rollo, now known by his Christian name Robert, spent the remaining years of his life doing something that the old sagas never quite knew how to glorify, because there is no easy song to sing about a man who simply governed well. He divided the land along the Seine among his Norse followers, established rules for justice that became legendary for their fairness even among the Frankish chroniclers who had every reason to dislike him, and built, region by region, the foundations of what would become the Duchy of Normandy. He died sometime around the year 930, an old man by the standards of his violent world, in his own bed, in a land that had once belonged to someone else and now belonged, completely and permanently, to him and to the people he had brought with him across the sea. What Rollo could not have known, lying in that bed in Normandy, was the scale of what he had actually started. His descendants did not simply inherit a small dukedom on the French coast and quietly fade into history. A few generations later, his great-great-great-grandson, a duke named William, looked across the English Channel at a kingdom he believed was rightfully his, and in the year 1066, he invaded. William the Conqueror carried Rollo's blood, Rollo's restless ambition, and in some ways, Rollo's entire story, repeated on a grander stage. A landless man takes what he believes he deserves by force, and the world, after enough resistance, eventually bends and lets him keep it. The Battle of Hastings, the fall of Anglo-Saxon England, the entire transformation of the English language, law, and aristocracy that followed, all of it traces back, link by link, to a Viking raider too heavy for any horse to carry, given land by a desperate king because killing him had become more expensive than trusting him. The Normans Rollo founded did not stop at England either. His descendants and the warrior culture he built eventually carried Norman knights into Sicily, into southern Italy, into the Crusades, into nearly every major conflict that shaped medieval Europe for the next 3 centuries. Today, the British royal family, along with much of the aristocracy of England, France, and beyond, can trace an unbroken line of descent back through William the Conqueror to Rollo himself, a man whose own name barely survived in reliable historical record, whose birth year remains a guess, whose entire early life is reconstructed from sagas written generations after he died. There is something quietly remarkable in that. Rollo was not a king born to greatness. He was an exile, a giant of a man rejected by his own homeland, who built a new one instead, and in doing so, without ever intending it, became the ancestor of nearly every English monarch who has ruled since 1066. He started as a problem no Frankish king could solve. He ended as the root of a family tree that still occupies thrones today. The raider who once made the Seine River run with fear became, in the strangest possible way, one of the most successful founding fathers in the history of Europe, simply by choosing, once, to stop running, and to build something instead.